And joining us now via Skype, Richard Nimijean. He is an instructor of Canadian Studies at Carleton University, and he joins us right now from his office on campus. Richard, it's good to have you on the line, as it were. We just had a discussion about how Prime Minister Stephen Harper is trying to change Canada's national identity. We've got that discussion up on our television program, The Agenda. But tell me why you believe a country's image is so important in a globalizing world.
Well, certainly, since the collapse of, communism and the Soviet Empire, and also with the rise of globalization, it's important for countries to get noticed in the world. People, goods, investment is much more mobile than it used to be. So if you think about it very pragmatically, and you had a big bag of money to invest, where would you go in the world? Would you go to Switzerland? Would you go to South Africa? Would you go to Poland? Would you go to the United States? The world is so much more accessible to us now, and often those decisions of investors or skilled labor are based on very simple images of countries. So that's one important reason. The other important reason, of course, is the usual aspect of diplomacy, which is to try to influence things. So how you are seen is important both economically and politically.
How do you think the world sees us right now?
Well, it depends on who you ask, of course. Certainly, for the longest amount of time, we were seen as some of your guests said earlier, as a multicultural, multilateral country that was a middle power, that was a broker. Increasingly, we're being seen as someone who's much more tightly aligned with the United States, that has a much more muscular foreign policy, which is principled leadership. So it depends on who you ask. But for a lot of other people, we're a big unknown, and when you don't know much about another part of the world, you go on simple stereotypes: snow, hockey, beer. These are things that the government was discovering, that much of the world, that influenced how they saw the world.
Well, The Economist magazine once upon a time called us cool, and I don't think they were referring to the temperature. I presume we like that kind of association around the world.
Well, we like that kind of association, and of course, The Economist called us cool because of things like the Kyoto Accord being signed, same-sex marriage. There were discussions about the decriminalization of marijuana, that we were seen as an alternative to the United States, and so getting noticed. What wasn't discussed as much is that Canadians, of course, were quite divided about these issues. And so, as your panel just showed, Canadians are divided on all sorts of issues, and this is why identity sort of becomes important in terms of both our brand image externally, but also domestically.
We should mention we've referred to the discussion that took place for television a couple of times already, and if people missed it on television, they can certainly see that discussion on our website, theagenda.tvo.org. I notice on the wall behind you a picture of Leonard Cohen. I presume he is part of what makes us cool in our branding around the world, yes?
Yes, very much so. Certainly, a big part of branding is image. So we're Skyping. I have an Apple computer in front of me that has a brand image. A good brand is something that not only is a good product, but also for the consumer, you like to believe that it says something about who you are. So if it's Nike or Apple or whatever the branded product is, it says something about you. In the same way, country image is about an image you desire, you want to be seen as. Interestingly, Simon Anholt, who runs this big nation branding survey all over the world, Canada is not seen as a very cultural place, even though we have Leonard Cohen, we have all these interesting artists. And people would say it's because of the cuts to public diplomacy. And interesting, in today's Globe and Mail, there was a story about how Foreign Affairs has cut the Understanding Canada program that promotes the study of Canada abroad, which is a policy tool to try to get Canada known more abroad.
But in our discussion for the television program, we talked about how Prime Minister Stephen Harper is trying to change Canada's brand by going sort of more gung-ho on patriotism, the armed forces, sports, the North. the monarchy, adding royal as an adjective to a lot of the institutions in the country, or some of them anyway. He's probably not the first person who's tried to change the country's brand. Can you give us some other examples from history of how that's happened, perhaps?
Well, certainly, most recently, in my work, I argue that the branding of countries has become more important as ideological differences have narrowed, ideological differences economically, that is. One effect of the collapse of, communism and the rise of globalization is that the economic differences between parties is quite different. So identity and country image is important to how politicians and parties sell themselves. Jean Chrétien, you're talking about cool Canada. That was part of the message. And also, he wanted Canada to be seen as a high-tech country, not a country of snow, hockey, and beer. And those were words of John Manley when he received the focus group report of U.S. high-tech investors in Dallas or Austin and Washington, when they said, "What do you think about Canada?" And they didn't see it as a very exciting place. They saw it as a cold place, not a high-tech place. So Canada tried to change its image, along with things like multiculturalism and diversity. So that's one example. Now, of course, with the Harper government, we are seeing a different kind of projection, more along the political and diplomatic lines about what Canada stands for.
Let's take the discussion away from the sort of overarching concern to election campaigns. And tell me this, how do you think politicians try to use the country's national identity during election campaigns?
Well, I have to say, and I hope the listeners get a chance to listen to your panel discussion, because your opening question was all about identity and rebranding, and it devolved into a big debate about politics and strategy and partisanship. And what I argue in my work is that the differences between parties on economic issues, historically, parties competed on economic visions of the country. So, if you go back to MacDonald and Laurier, you had fundamental differences about what the country's, where they wanted to take the country, or the free trade debate. These were big visions of Canada that had a vision of government as well, or the NDP in the old days talking about socializing banks, expanding government. If you think about, all the debates that you've moderated, and I should say I was at the last federal debate in Ottawa last year, and, if I was to ask you, what was the big economic fight that was going on, it's tough to, do you remember it all? If I can ask you a question?
Well, the one question I do remember asking in the course of that debate was, the NDP stood for raising corporate taxes by maybe 2 points. The Liberals were going to raise them by maybe 1.5 points. The Conservatives were going to leave them about where they were, maybe lower them a bit. For these broad ideological differences, they were all within 3 or 4 percentage points on the corporate tax of each other. That's what sticks in my head.
That's exactly the answer. And if you ask people and they say, "Well, I can't really think of anything," right? And people who follow the news obviously will remember that. And we're talking about $1 billion, $2 billion, which is not chump change, but it's not talking about expanding the role of government or whatever. We're all for lower taxes. We're all for no deficit. Jack Layton, talked about progressive values, and then we had discussions of fiscal conservatism, and which actually Jean Chrétien used to do. So that's why. In our election campaigns, the last election was about progressive Canada versus a more responsible Canada or a more principled Canada. Those are values, but they're very, very hard to actually decipher what they mean when the policy differences aren't there. I should also say that on social policy, where a lot of these values get expressed, there are differences. But this is, I would suggest, a big difference in the history of Canadian elections.
Okay, so why do political parties try to do these things during election campaigns, in your view?
Well, because they think it works, right? If you think about strategies under our system of government, you're not actually trying to represent all or get the support of all Canadians or all provincial citizens. You're trying to get a certain number, but you do want to convey the image that you represent them. So just as Nike or Apple may speak to you, your brand of partisanship, your party speaks to people on different levels. And so the shorthand of what you think somebody represents, most of us don't know the detailed policy platforms of the various parties. There's an interesting debate right now about the UN food envoy going to Canada, and your colleague, David Paikin, said, well, I looked at all the party platforms and no one, only the Liberals mentioned a food policy. So what, so clearly Canadians don't care. Well, we don't vote on that. We vote on, does this party represent what I feel about the world? And so if you look at the last election campaign, look at the NDP manifesto, it's all pictures of Jack and the flag. Right? And the same way that Harper does. Harper is a guy who in 1997 said, essentially there's no national culture, and saying to Americans, we'll never have as strong a national identity as you will. And now, 15 years later, we're one of the most patriotic, proud countries in the world. It works.
So there really are very precious few election campaigns where the vast ideological or issue-oriented differences among the parties, say the free trade campaign of '88, or if you want to go back even further, 1911 on reciprocity, these are few and far between, aren't they?
They are, and it's not that they don't happen, but it's almost like you happen into them. As you know more than anyone, campaigns can turn on unpredictable things, like in Alberta about a committee that no one shows up for and gets paid. So who do you trust? Well, trust is a very amorphous kind of concept. If you remember Stephen Harper, how were the Liberals trying to frame him initially, back in the last decade, as an Americanizing influence, a militaristic influence? And do you remember the press conference where a journalist said, do you love Canada? I mean, the guy's running to lead the country and he's being asked if he loves the country. And even though he gave a very good answer that talked about policy and so forth, the headlines were, we're not so sure about this guy. So how does Mr. Harper go from questioning identity to being a super patriotic prime minister? It's because it works.
My recollection of that was it was a bit of a double standard to ask him that question, but then he kind of pooched the answer. He wouldn't say the word love, and people picked up on that. And when you got, Jean Chrétien saying, I love Canada 25 times in a speech, that's noticeable, isn't it?
Well, and your guest, the former speechwriter, talked about the evolving attitudes of Mr. Harper as almost as if it's an experiment. I think that was part of his education of becoming a politician, right? Like, Chrétien, when he was asked about same-sex marriage, initially was against it. 3 years later, was for it. And what does he say? Vive le Canada, bonsoir, good night.
Hey, it worked 3 times in a row for him, my friend.
It did. It did.
Let's finish up on this one more time. Now, you're an academic. You study this kind of thing.
Sure.
So I'm inferring from this, and you tell me if I'm wrong, I'm inferring that you're not necessarily a touchy-feely guy on this kind of stuff. So do you think it's problematic that voters, citizens, make their choices based more on, say values or what they see themselves as having in common with candidates, as opposed to, I like your policies versus your policies?
Yeah, well, certainly one of the big challenges, when I try to explain to students, how do you study Canada? One of the challenges is we're studying ourselves, right? And we are participants, right, in what we're talking about. And I do have perceptions and feelings, but I'm also someone who's inclined to read up on things. But I think the big challenge about it is that it affects our governance, it affects the quality of our democracy, because we're not actually evaluating our politicians to a higher standard to say, well, if you actually get elected, what are you going to do and how are you different than other people? Rather than, when we get stuff like the Prime Minister saying conservative values and Canadian values are one and the same, well, there's 60% of the country that aren't conservative. Just like Mr. Harper, going back to 2004, when he said, do you have to be a Liberal to be a Canadian? Canadian values, Canadian identity, those values emerge out of what we choose to do as a society. So if we think Canada is a middle power, a good international Boy Scout kind of a country, that might be rooted in what we do. Harper's critique of the Liberals was rooted in, well, we don't do these things anymore, and we're going to stand up for something different. Again, it's action. It's not about values, but unfortunately, we live busy lives. We know we don't. The citizenry as a whole does not follow politics, read news as much. So that trust factor, who do you trust, is really important for us. So, and I think journalists and the media have also a bit of role to play. We do tend to get caught up in a lot of the horse race and the inside baseball kind of stuff.
Okay, no more inside baseball. Richard Nimijean, thanks a lot for joining us on the line from Ottawa today, and best of luck with your Canadian Studies courses at Carleton University.
My pleasure, Steve. Thanks for having me on.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.